Tonight on KQED Newsroom, she's among a diverse group of Congress members shaking up Capitol Hill. Newly elected Congresswoman Katie Hill made LGBTQ rights a part of her platform in the midterms and won. And Google goes to Washington. Its chief executive testified before Congress amid mounting concerns over how tech companies handle free speech and data privacy. Plus, a state bill to build housing near transit hubs that died in the legislature earlier this year gets a second chance. Could it help alleviate California's housing crisis? Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the new face of Capitol Hill. This midterm election, Democrats fought to regain a majority in the House by flipping Republican seats in hard-won campaigns. Many are young and holding elected office for the first time, including 31-year-old Democrat Katie Hill. She defeated two-term Republican incumbent Steve Knight in a district that covers Los Angeles and Ventura counties. Hill has vowed to tackle complex issues such as homelessness while also focusing on the working middle class, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community. Hill and her staff have been called the most millennial campaign ever and are now part of a fresh generation of leaders in a new House majority. And Congresswoman-elect Katie Hill joins me now via Skype from Santa Clarita. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, what have the past few weeks been like for you since winning the election?
It's been a whirlwind. There was definitely not any time for a break, but it was going back and forth to D.C. We had a ton of leadership elections and kind of getting our offices squared away. And then we went to Harvard for a bipartisan kind of training. And now it's back home. So I'm working a little this week, and then I'm going to try and take a little bit of time off.
Yeah, well,
it's been 18 months.
Oh, I bet. You've been working very hard. In fact, you're one of 14 elected members of the new House Democratic Caucus. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
What perspective, you're 31 years old, you have a background in running an organization that provides homeless services. What perspective do you bring to the caucus that you think is lacking right now?
Sure. Well, I think having a nonprofit background and really that piece of it, that service piece of it, the fulfilling the mission of helping people and bringing all the different stakeholders together to affect change in the community, that's something that I think is incredibly important and that I bring to the table. And it also, having worked on literally hundreds of different government contracts, I know the ins and outs and what works and what doesn't about so many of our federal services. But beyond that, as a young woman, as part of this new generation of people moving into leadership positions in Congress, I think that perspective alone is something that's been missing, and I look forward to bringing to the table.
You represent change, yet at the same time, you've supported having Nancy Pelosi come back as House Speaker, even before she announced this week that she would limit herself to 4 years in the post. Why Nancy Pelosi and not someone new?
I've worked on transitions and really preparing for a leadership transition in my role in the nonprofit sector. And I think having somebody who's at the helm who really can help us navigate this process, learn how to be effective, and deal with the fact that we only are going to have power in the House, not in the Senate, not in the presidency. So, 70% of us as a freshman class have never held elected office before. So we need to be looking at, the people who have more experience than us. And at the same time, prepare for a transition that is inevitable at this point.
And what about you yourself? What are the top priorities you will be pushing come January?
My approach to things is that we need to be as effective as possible in the pieces of legislation that we know we're going to pass. So within appropriations bills, within the Farm Bill, and within these pieces like transportation and infrastructure packages that we think are likely to make it beyond just the House of Representatives. So that's what I'll be looking for, different kind of angles to affect, some kind of movement on legislation. But beyond that,
would you be focusing primarily on things that you think you can get some bipartisan appeal out of it? What about other things that are perhaps a little more divisive, trying to abolish ICE or impeaching President Trump? What will you do on those issues?
So those aren't reflective of my district, and frankly, they're not really reflective of my views. I think, reform ICE, absolutely. Have real immigration reform, absolutely. And and some of the other pieces that impeaching President Trump, I don't think is something we should do right now, since we have to have Republican support for that to actually go anywhere. And instead, I think we need to focus on protecting the Mueller investigation and on, conducting our oversight responsibilities as a Congress. So I would say I support measures in that direction, but not as, I'm simply not as far left as, some people are from these districts that are totally blue.
President Trump is threatening to shut down the U.S. government if he doesn't get funding for a border wall. And this week we saw a very tense televised Oval Office meeting between him and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. What's your reaction to that standoff? What does it tell you about the mood in Washington right now?
I think the stance that we as Democrats need to take is that we don't have the majority in any chamber. And so if there's a shutdown, it is entirely on Donald Trump and the Republicans. And once we get there, we can talk about, our piece of it. And so if President Trump wants to get anything done, if the Republicans want to get anything done, they're going to have to work with us, and vice versa. So there will be a move towards cooperation in some capacity, but it's not going to be easy. And there's always going to be tension. But I think there are so many of us who are committed to actual, change and actually accomplishing things that we'll see a change in tone.
All right, and just on a lighter note here, you tweeted something pretty amusing recently related to your transition to Congress. You ran into Nancy Pelosi last month at the airport, and you lamented your casual appearance. There you are with a very cute photo of yourself, totally exhausted, while adding in your tweet that Pelosi looks flawless. And you said sometimes you just have to laugh and trust the process. So a very good sense of humor. And now that the campaign is over, what has surprised you the most about the whole process of running for office and winning office?
I actually think, since I got elected, one of the things that surprised me the most in a really, really positive way is that as a freshman class, we are already working incredibly collaboratively together, and we're being heard by leadership and by these more senior members who are making a real effort to change the way that things have historically been done and involve us in the process and make sure that our priorities and our opinions are really prioritized. So I think that, there is a certain sense of like, oh, we're going to have to go in and fight to change a lot of these things, but we're pushing for a lot of these things, but there has been an incredible receptiveness to it. So I think it just all gives me so much optimism for the future and for what this next 2 years are going to look like.
All right. On that optimistic note, we will leave it there. Congresswoman-elect Katie Hill, congratulations again, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now to tech. Google's chief executive Sundar Pichai testified before the House Judiciary Committee this week. He denied allegations from some lawmakers that the company suppresses conservative viewpoints in Google search results. The company also faced questions about privacy and data collection. Similar questions are being leveled at Facebook for how it handles consumer data. Meanwhile, the recent arrest of one of China's leading technology executives at the request of Washington has ignited fears in Silicon Valley that China might retaliate. Here now with this week's Tech Roundup are The Verge's Silicon Valley editor, Casey Newton, MarketWatch tech editor and San Francisco bureau chief, Jeremy Owens, and Axios chief technology correspondent, Ina Fried. Welcome to you all. So, Ina, more troubles for Facebook today. The company revealed a major security flaw may have allowed third-party apps to improperly access people's photos, even those that hadn't been fully been uploaded. And this could affect nearly 7 million users. When did Facebook know about this, and why are they telling us just now?
Well, this is the biggest issue. So it's bad enough that these are photos that you wanted to post. It's photos that you might not have even wanted to post, and then that they basically have known about it since September and are just letting the public know about it in December and just letting European regulators know about it in November. That's actually could end up being the bigger story here.
Well, this is part of a larger pattern, right? I mean, we hear over and over again, oh, we had this flaw, we had this breach, and we don't hear about it until months later. So are there any calls to fine Facebook at this point or have some kind of other sanction or penalty?
Well, there are provisions in both the new European law as well as the consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission that do require Facebook and companies to notify about data breaches. So this is where actually you can find consequences. There's basically no law at this point that prevents companies from having data breaches, which is good because they all lose our data. But there are laws about how and when they notify people. And this could come back to bite them.
And do we have any information? Are they disclosing any information on which apps had access and how these photos might have been used?
Yeah, so I don't think we've seen the complete list yet, but we know that there were 1,500 apps from something like 850 developers. So it was a lot of people who could have seen those photos. I will say, though, that among all of the Facebook data breaches this year, this is maybe one I'm less concerned about. When I think about the photos I take with a Facebook app but don't upload them, it's like bad selfies, blurry photos, low light photos, right? It's stuff that I probably don't want a developer to have, but I'm not going to freak out if they see it.
As opposed to something like, say, Cambridge Analytica, for example. Right. And I know that you've also been following the Google hearing that happened this week, Casey, and you wrote an article that was very critical of the hearing, taking to task both CEOs, tech CEOs, and lawmakers for not doing a better job of clarifying problems around issues like data privacy. How do you think, well, why do you think, first of all, they're not doing a good job?
Well, I think that in situations like this, the sides keep talking past each other. And on the lawmaker side, they often seem to fundamentally misunderstand how the platform works, sometimes in ways that feel intentional, like they're trying to rally their base. And for their part, I think the CEOs, including Sundar in this case, they just try to say as little as possible, where I think they would have an opportunity to answer the spirit of the lawmakers' questions, even if the lawmakers don't get the details exactly right.
So how can they do better?
Well, I would love to see the lawmakers develop some basic platform literacy. So, for example, they could understand that Google has real financial incentives not to make their search results politically biased. Google wants to serve as many people as possible, and that means serving the best search results. It doesn't mean trying to skew things one way or the other. And then again, on the Sundar Pichai front, he faced a lot of questions about what Google is doing in China, and all he would really say about it is, we have no plans to launch right now. His answers were irrelevant by the time the hearing was over, right? And we actually know that Google has invested a lot in developing some kinds of products for China. So I would love to see him give better answers to those questions in the future.
I'd love to see lawmakers actually make some laws. Like the most important thing that Sundar said in that hearing is he's okay with a GDPR-style regulation in the United States. And we continue to have these hearings. How many have we had this year now, right? Like it feels like half a dozen.
Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter's Jack Dorsey.
To Jeremy's point, in that time, there's actually built consensus. Privacy groups, tech companies, the industry, everyone said, okay, here's a framework for what we'd be fine with. And you actually have privacy groups and tech companies not that far apart. So I do think we'll see that in the new year.
And we're 20 years into the internet and 10 years into social media and mobile phones, and we still haven't developed these kind of laws to address those services that have really changed how we interact with each other and how we interact with the world.
And to Ina's point, do you think that come 2019, with the new Congress in place, we will see more regulation?
Well, it depends on if the Democrats really make that a hard part of their platform, right? They're going to have to get in there and decide what they want to go for. And I feel like with all of these hearings and with the backlash from Americans, that would be one that they could go for and maybe find some consensus even in the polarized times that are happening in Congress.
I suspect we will see it because California passed a big privacy law this year that incorporates some of these provisions that folks would like to roll out nationally. And that goes into effect in 2020, which means there's kind of a ticking clock. And if the tech companies can't reach a consensus by then, there's going to be a patchwork of regulations all across the country, and that would be a nightmare for them.
The problem with California law is it's not really set in stone what it is. They basically passed a blank sheet of paper and said, we'll come back to it and tell you what these laws are going to be. So until we know what those laws are, it's very hard to then see that transfer to the federal level.
Yeah, but you still have to imagine they would light a fire under them somewhat because they don't want a whole patchwork of laws across the country. Also want to talk to you about some more disturbing news about apps that emerged this week, apps knowingly tracking our private data once again. The New York Times in its latest investigation found that all kinds of apps, from those used for tracking weather to your exercise routines, they constantly monitor your location and then sell that information without your knowledge. Who's buying this data, Ina, and how is it used?
So, I mean, it's very valuable and very personal data that is useful, very useful to advertisers. So stores want to know where you're at. Burger King just launched a thing where, you know, in their app, they'll tell you if you're within a mile of a McDonald's, you can get a free burger. So that location data is very valuable.
But that's why, I mean, I don't really want people to know when I'm at the doctor or, you know.
So here's the thing. You might be using, you mentioned the example of, you know, a weather app. Well, that weather app to work well needs to know exactly where you are. So when that permission comes up, you go, should weather app X be able to know my location always when I'm only in the app. And if you click always, they're always getting your location.
24/7.
24/7. That means not only do they know to serve you the right weather, but they actually know where you live because you spend 8 hours a night, hopefully, in your house each night. And if they're selling that data, so what I'd like to see is not just permissions, can they use the app, can they use the location? I would like to see them have to disclose whether they're going to use that internally or share it with anyone else. And, we were talking about this beforehand, but really, until we know better, I would just not give apps, particularly permission to always use the location.
So no, when you see that message come up, no, you do not have access to my location unless you're using it. I want to talk about Huawei as well. That is a major story. At Washington's behest, Canadian authorities arrested a top Huawei executive. This is the major Chinese telecom company. And U.S. prosecutors say that she violated American sanctions against Iran. Jeremy, there's a lot of business between U.S. companies, particularly in Silicon Valley and China. What's been the reaction in Silicon Valley?
Well, it's been fear about going to China. I mean, I feel like every exec now who has to go to China and back is worried about going to China and facing reprisal. We have learned that 2 Canadian nationals have been arrested in China, prominent Canadian nationals. And that's just going to create worry about going to China and being in China and dealing with China and what the reaction is going to be from them.
Are tech executives changing their travel plans as a result?
Yes.
I think individuals are, early on we heard Cisco maybe considering stopping all executive travel to China, then they relaxed it. But I think, you just don't know. If you're an executive, that means you're a person, and do you really want to risk your safety and your family's integrity to go on a business trip? And I think that is the danger of this. Whether they had cause or not, it's the type of thing that's very easy to escalate and very hard to rein back.
And that's the danger of all of our kind of brinksmanship with China right now, is nobody's really stood up to China like this. How are they going to react? What are the actions are they going to take? And it's scary to think about what they could do. And so we're going to continue to think about it until we see what they actually do.
Yeah, it sort of just feels like this trade war has been escalating nonstop for a year now, and the stakes keep getting higher, and it doesn't seem like anyone at the top of either country is really invested in making it stop anytime soon.
And I think what you have that's really interesting and is going to be an issue for a while is you have both countries see their tech industries as key to their strategic independence. At the same time, the way the tech industry is structured today, China and the U.S. are incredibly interdependent on one another.
You have a lot of Chinese money invested in tech
You have
companies
Chinese
here.
money in tech companies. You have China needs U.S. silicon today. They need the chips from Qualcomm to make their phones, but the U.S. needs those phones to be made in China to serve the U.S. market. So as much as each side would love to be not dependent on one another, they really are today.
All right. All interesting to follow. Ina Freed, Casey Newton, and also Jeremy Owens, thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Sui.
With California's new legislative session underway, housing is among the top issues. One attempt to address the state's intractable housing crisis is Senate Bill 50, which would require high-density residential developments near major transit stations. The legislation is a revision of another bill that died in committee earlier this year. The new version incorporates more protections for neighborhoods at risk of displacement and gentrification, and also targets wealthier communities for development. Joining me now to discuss this are State Senator Scott Wiener, the bill's sponsor, and also law professor Ethan Elkind, who studies transportation and land use law at UC Berkeley. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Wiener, this is the second time you're introducing legislation of this type to require high-density residential development near transit hubs. What are you hoping to accomplish with this?
Sure. Well, we have a terrible housing crisis in California, a housing deficit of 3.5 million homes, which is equal to the deficit in the other 49 states combined. And we see the results with working families being pushed out, people being pushed into homelessness, young people unable to get a foothold, and we have to take real action. So as we build those 3.5 million homes, what we don't want to do is keep building sprawl further and further away so people have 2 2-hour commutes, so we're building in wildfire zones. We want to put that housing near public transportation and near jobs.
Well, the first version of your bill, though, died in committee, and one of the major complaints was that it mandated development in primarily disadvantaged communities, since those are primarily the neighborhoods that are closest to major transit, yet it spared wealthier cities. What changes have you made to address those concerns?
Sure, and to be clear, the prior bill did include wealthy communities as well, but it was disproportionately in low-income areas. We took that criticism to heart, and so right now, the current bill, it allows a delayed implementation in low-income communities at risk of displacement so that local communities can plan to prevent displacement, and it also includes communities that may not have a lot of transit but have a lot of jobs. So people might drive, but they're driving shorter distances. And right now
For example, Palo Alto, Mountain View, where a lot of the tech companies are.
Or Cupertino, there are various cities also in Southern California that fall in that category. And we have a problem now where we know we need the housing to go by transit and jobs, but in so many of our areas that are job centers, that are transit centers, apartment buildings are banned. Only single-family homes are allowed, which is not sustainable.
So, Professor Elkind, regarding the provision that Senator Wiener just mentioned, the one that applies to what you're calling job-rich areas, right, like Cupertino, where Apple is, or Palo Alto and Mountain View, how big a shift is that in California's housing policy? Because up until now, really, local governments have a lot of say over development in their cities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the tradition in California and many other states of local control, where local governments, cities and counties get to say what the zoning is going to be, how tall buildings are, how far apart they're going to be from each other. And the result of that is that we've seen over and over and over again, these cities, these counties say no to new housing. And so in terms of having a jobs-rich housing provision in this new legislation, we'll have to see how that's defined, but I think these Silicon Valley communities here in the Bay Area are really a good poster child for that. They've been very willing to greenlight projects that bring in a lot of jobs, but not the commensurate housing. And so what they're essentially saying is we want all of these workers to be housed elsewhere outside of our community, and we want to essentially put those burdens of the commuting on everyone else, because then people are clogging up the freeways for the whole region.
So what has been the reaction from those cities to this latest version of the bill, SB 50?
Well, they've been uniformly opposed to any loss of their sovereignty over land use, and that's been the big battle in California, and that's why you haven't seen legislation really until Senator Wiener's SB 827 and then now SB 50 that's really tried to rein in some of that local control. But that's a very powerful dynamic. They're a very powerful interest group at some of our wealthiest communities. They like their communities low density, and so this is a big fight with them. And I think the question is the coalition in favor? All those people who weren't fortunate enough to buy homes when homes were cheaper and tax burdens were lower, or is that discontent enough to push this over the finish line?
But there's another point that some critics are making too, is that transit near housing makes sense in places where there's a comprehensive transit system, like New York, for example. We don't really have something like that here in the Bay Area, unless you're in the city, in San Francisco, then it works fairly well. So how can your bill be truly effective? How many people can it actually serve?
We actually, especially in the Bay Area, we have quite a bit of transit. Yes, of course, San Francisco, but Caltrain and BART, and we do have quite a few high-frequency bus lines because buses are included in the legislation. In Los Angeles, they're building, God bless them, an enormous number of new rail and subway lines. So we are seeing increased investment. And one of the reasons in this new bill that we included job-rich areas was to be clear that you can be a hub where people work even if you don't have transit. So we want to make sure we're addressing both. But the core principle here is people should be able to live near where they work and near public transportation. And right now, because of hyper-restrictive zoning, they can't do that. People are basically being kicked out.
And Ethan, are there examples of other regions with a public transportation situation similar to the Bay Area where high-density housing has worked and succeeded in housing more people?
Yeah, in some ways we're really going back to the original vision of what cities were. They were walkable, very vibrant places that people could live in more compact neighborhoods, and we see examples of that all over the world. Here, more locally in the U.S., I think Portland is a very good example of a community that's really tried to focus development inward and boost reduce their transit system. Seattle has taken some really progressive steps in the last decade or so, and so you see transit ridership increasing, you see home prices generally stabilizing there. So there certainly are models that we can draw from.
Is it a cultural problem in California, do you think, with the suburban sprawl?
Well, California certainly pioneered the auto-dependent type of lifestyle, LA in particular, and now you see it across the West with Phoenix, Vegas, parts of Texas. So we definitely pioneered it, but I think there's a lot of people who really want that kind of an urban lifestyle. You see the skyrocketing demand when there are neighborhoods that provide that kind of lifestyle. I mean, you think of lots of neighborhoods in San Francisco, Rockridge, for example. They're very desirable. So there is a lot of demand for it. We just haven't been good at building it, primarily because of the pressure from these single-family homeowner groups that don't want to see those types of neighborhoods built.
And Scott, you've also co-authored another ballot measure, a ballot measure as opposed to this bill that you have. And this is one that targets the 2020 ballot. It would repeal a clause in California's Constitution, Article 34, that bans cities and counties from developing or buying low-income rental housing without a majority vote of taxpayers. Yeah. This is something that's been in place since 1950. How does it hurt the housing problem?
Sure. So it's really hard to believe that Article 34 is part of progressive California's Constitution. It is a racist, classist relic of a time period where people wanted to keep largely black people out of their neighborhoods. And certainly poor people out of their neighborhoods. And so what happened was after World War II, there was a significant migration of African American people from the South primarily to California. And so Oakland, San Francisco, other places had a growing African American population. And some people got really upset that African Americans were moving into their neighborhoods.
And so what that ban did really was to slow down construction, right? It made developers have to show that no more than 49% of funding for their projects came from government.
So this constitutional amendment that was passed said that it is illegal for a city to build public low-income housing without putting it out to a vote of the people. It's the only kind of housing that the Constitution requires to have a vote of the people, and we need to get rid of this.
Okay, and Professor Elkind, we only have about 30 seconds remaining, but what is your biggest fear of what will happen if we don't resolve this housing crisis?
Well, we're going to see continued economic inequality. What I'm really concerned about is that the way California is going, we're only going to have homes affordable to the very privileged, the very wealthy, the very elite, and we're hemorrhaging our middle class. So unless we solve this, I'm really worried about having a very unequal state, as well as an environmentally unsustainable one.
All right. Professor Ethan Elkind with UC Berkeley and State Senator Scott Wiener, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.